So you were mentioning in your background, the importance, of looking at psychology and kind of blending that into your work. And so one thing that we're talking a lot about in higher education, I think in education in general, is mental health and its importance to have psychological safety, to be able to learn and to be able to grow. How and why do you think we should take mental health into account in the advertising industry?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those areas that I've kind of had hunches for a long time. So I suspect this will be this will resonate with you and other people. Is that when I don't feel okay, and I mean I don't feel emotionally okay, I'm not as creative. I can be creative, but it's not as. I've always wondered whether I could be much better if I felt better. And as an industry, and again, I've being away from it for a bit and dipping in and out. The industry itself, and I put in the creative industry generally, so it's sister organizations, where creativity is the bread and butter of what it does. They're not known as as industries for their low pressure environments. They are, I've heard this phrase there, there's a kind of culture of endurance. You just keep going. I'm not going to complain. But also they're not particularly good. If you look at I think the data supports this, is they're not particularly good at looking after their people from a mental health point of view. There's a lot of tokenism. And I kind of had this hunch. I thought this, especially when you get anywhere near a kind of pitch environment, you get into very stressful. It's very stressful kind of moment, but also an ability to deliver really creative ideas. And I suspect that that's the case with TV and film and all that sort of stuff. And that kind of hunch kind of manifested itself when I started working with MyMind, who I mentioned before, and a very good friend of mine who's the founder and CEO of it. And we started talking about creativity in the context of the data that they were getting on, they work with the NHS, they work with Tesco's, they work with lots of different people. And they have aggregated data that's anonymous, so you can't, it's highly confidential. So you can see the data, but you don't know the people, and you start to see kind of patterns where you've got people are less creative when they're put in difficult situations. And the way that we described it when we were talking was when you're feeling well. So you mentioned the word psychological safety, which is a useful frame. You're able to build bridges. And by that is, I mean, you're able to bridges to different kind of ways of thinking, different ideas, different kinds of people. You're just more empathetic to the world. When you don't feel safe, when you feel threatened, you build walls. And that you can, I mean, I'm like this. If I get really stressed, luckily it doesn't happen very often, I can feel the walls coming up. I've become solidified in my thinking style, and my point of view is very rigid. I kind of, and you can see that in lots of other studies, but also the kind of studies that are coming out of MyMind. And what was interesting was when you have that conversation with yourself, you realize actually there's also a case for discomfort. So if you look at the recent pandemic and then the other really stressful times like 2008 financial crisis, you look at the world wars, they were also moments of incredible creativity. And so I was trying to work out, well, this cognitive dissonance, how do you align those things? Because on one side you've got, I'd argue that the reason why those times are very creative is because the cultures and organizations are able to take a really good look at the conventions and the assumptions, and they're able to go, actually, are they right? And if we break them, what happens? So there's this idea that you've got this relationship between psychological safety and creativity, but also there's also being stressed is also a fuel behind that creativity. So I was trying to work out what the bridge between those two things are, and I found this really interesting study. I can send you the link afterwards. It's a Chinese study on Chinese students, and they were looking at getting them to think creatively, and they had some really good ways of measuring that. But what they found was, firstly, that it explained and it ramified the idea that when you feel safe, you're more creative. But they also, when they looked at the context around which that creativity happens, what makes it really what they call psychological empowerment, where you go, they shift from psychological safety to psychological empowerment, is when you're in a, they call it a fault tolerance culture, where you're actually allowed to make mistakes, and they know that mistakes are part of the system. And for me, I kept coming back to my experiences with networks, my experiences with creative industries, is you realize that, so let's take a worst case scenario, like a pitch situation. There isn't really much tolerance for fault and making mistakes. Very tight schedule, very tight delivery. You have to make very quick choices on what ideas are. Now imagine if you take that away, how do you have how creative are you going to be in that environment? So for me, there's a much bigger conversation about if the creative industries, including the ad industry, are really in the business of doing really interesting creative work, mental health must be at the center of that. It's a core capability. It's a core competence to that psychological empowerment. I don't see a lot of that. I don't think that's a conversation that happens very often. You might have experienced a different one in the States, but certainly in Europe, that doesn't seem to be a conversation that happens very often. I think there's a recognition that mental health is important for lots of reasons, but I don't think it's often tied back to, well, actually, how are we helping people really think creatively? And for me, that's just a conversation that needs to be had, I think, on lots of levels.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the same in academia, where sometimes it's talked more about in relation to our students, but I think in terms of the professors and researchers themselves also need to think about that among themselves. And interestingly, the Ad Council has put out a campaign for mental health in the US, lots of different public service announcements. But again, it sounds like, the industry itself, maybe you can lead the charge.
Well, I mean, I don't know, but it just seemed really strange when you begin to understand how important mental health is, and feeling well and feeling good is to creativity, and how important actually making sure that you have an environment that allows you to make mistakes. That's not something I recognize when I think about my experiences, my previous experiences, my current experiences. And it's all very well to do an ad campaign about it, but it's more important to actually live that, and because you'll end up with better work anyway.
Yeah. And it gets back to that belonging piece of the diversity, equity, and inclusion. How do you feel like you belong if you don't have that psychological safety?
Yeah. And whether we agree with it or not, we deep down we know it's true. We need, most of us like to feel okay. Yeah. And when we don't, I mean, anybody who's had, anybody who's had any sort of mental health issues, know that it is the lens through which you see the world. You can be in the same situation in a different day and interpreted it completely differently. I've got friends who've been very unwell, and you realize that actually you're looking at the same thing, exactly the same thing, and they see it. It's almost like a different world, black and white.
Yeah.
And that's an extreme example, but where it's less binary, it's very, very important, those sort of conversations, for lots of reasons.